Greeting to all attendees. Welcome to the third session of the Islamic History and Thought lecture series organized by the Institute of Ismaili Studies. If you have missed the two previous lectures by Dr. Mathieu Terrier on Twelver Shiʿi Tafsir and by Dr. Wissam Halawi on the Druze, or if you wish to see them again, they have been recorded and they are now available to watch on the IAS website, as well as on the newly created YouTube channel of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. So today I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Edmund Hayes, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Radboud University. Dr. Hayes works on early Islam and has devoted part of his recent research to the institutions of the Imamate. As a matter of fact, he has just published an article in the latest issue of Al-Masaq, Journal of the Medieval Mediterranean, entitled The Institutions of the Shi'i Imamate Towards a Social History of Early Imami Shi'ism. He also studied the economy of the Imamate in a forthcoming article entitled The Imams as Economic Actors, Early Imami Shi'ism as a Sacred Economy. So this article will appear in a collective volume edited by Fanny Bessa and Hugh Kennedy on the early Islamic economy. Dr. Hayes recently completed a monograph that bears the same title as today's lecture, Agents of the Hidden Imam, Forging Twelver Shiřism, which is to be published by Cambridge University Press. And so he will be telling us about this work today. The lecture will last for about 30 to 45 minutes and will be followed by a discussion with myself and two guests who kindly accepted to take part in this session. Dr. Karen Bauer, who is a senior research associate at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and Dr. Mushera Satriyan, who is an associate professor at the University of Calgary in Canada. Sorry. So during the lecture and the following discussion, the public is strongly encouraged to send their questions in writing through the Q&A option at the bottom of the control panel. And as time allows, I will convey as much of your questions to the speaker. So I will now give the floor to Dr. Edmund Hayes.
Thank you very much, Fârès, and thanks for the Institute for hosting, and thank you especially to Moshe and Karen for being here as discussants. I think we all have enough online meetings, so I feel I'm really grateful that you could make it here. So yeah, as Fârès said, what I'm going to talk to you about today is a little distillation of some of the things I talk about in my book. So one of the main sort of things to note about this book is that I'm really trying to look at the social and political context of this period, during which we see the canonization of the central doctrine of Twelver Shiřism, that is the belief in a messianic 12th Imam who is currently in hiding or in occultation. The transition to this belief was also marked by a terminological transition from what we call now, or what we could have called beforehand, the Imami Shiʿi to the Twelver Shiʿi. Of course, there is the Imami Shiʿi continue to be used among the Twelver community, but I will be using Imami to refer to the community that existed before the canonization of this occultation doctrine. The key focus of the work is of these agents of the Imam. And the key question I'm going to focus on today is, why did the occultation happen? But as I say, from a sociological and political point of view rather than pure intellectual history. So first I'll just frame the question a bit and look at previous approaches to this subject, both traditional and modern, and why I think previous approaches have been unsatisfactory. And then I'll try and frame some better approaches to the question and give some answers. So to back up a bit, it's interesting to think about how the end of a line of religious leaders might happen. And in recent years, there's been an interesting comparable sort of set of questions with the Dalai Lama, who has suggested that he might not reincarnate when he dies, that might be the end to the line of Dalai Lamas. So yeah, it's interesting. Why would a line of religious leaders terminate itself? Why would it collapse? There are, of course, they're very different contexts, but they're an interesting parallel with the context of the Dalai Lama is that of political persecution. So in the case of the Dalai Lamas, we have a strong surveillance from the Chinese Communist Party. And in the case of the Imams, we see very interested Abbasid surveillance. In both cases, well, we see that the successor is going to be a child. So the Abbasid government were very interested in, according to our sources, in looking for the child in the successor to the Imams in several after several deaths of Imams, and that's the same case for the 11th Imam. And as well, I would suggest that the results on the way this process works is not really based on doctrine. Doctrine comes into play, and it comes into play in defining what a religious leader is and how divine guidance mediates itself in the world. But basically, this is a political question, a sociological question about how institutions operate. So what is the context here that we're talking about? The basic story in the case of the hidden Imam is that the 11th Imam, Al-Hasan al-Askari, died in 874 of the Common Era. He was 28 years old, and the 6 short years of his imamate had been troubled. His brother Ja'far had claimed to be the rightful Imam himself. Factions had formed and insults had been hurled. The followers of Ja'far called Hassan a donkey with no knowledge, and his followers, therefore, the donkey faction, al-Himariya. When al-Hassan died childless, these splits only deepened. Although Ja'far was the only visible candidate for the imamate, the followers of Hassan could not accept him. Instead, stories arose that another imam existed somewhere. One of Hassan's concubines claimed to be pregnant with his child. This posthumous pregnancy caused great excitement. A contemporary witness, reported later in Kuleni's Kafi, describes the scene as follows. When Al-Hassan died, a great commotion arose at Samarra, and the caliph sent someone to Al-Hassan's house to examine it. He examined its rooms and sealed everything in it. He asked about Al-Hassan's offspring left behind. They brought women experienced in matters of pregnancy who went to the concubines and inspected them. One of them mentioned that a certain concubine was pregnant. She was put in a room and she was watched. Then the markets were closed and the Banu Hashim rode out along with the great men and the rest of the people to go to his funeral. And on that day, Samarra was like Judgment Day. While they continued to search for Hassan's offspring, they delayed the division of his inheritance. The people who were entrusted with watching the apparently pregnant concubine persisted until it was clear that it was a phantom pregnancy. Then the inheritance was divided between Al-Hassan's mother and his brother Ja'far. And that's the end of the quote. This account depicts close governmental surveillance of the process of choosing an imam. It also shows the internal divisions of the family of the imam, just as we see divisions in other rich and powerful families with bitter squabbles over money and influence. The big difference with other families is that after much contestation, a new religious denomination emerged from this squabble, and along with it, a new Twelver periodization of religious history. In this new vision of history, we have the era of the prophets, ending with Muhammad, then the era of the visible imams, ending with Al-Hasan al-Askari. And then we have 2 further periods, one a period of lesser occultation, in which it is believed the envoys mediated for a hidden Imam. And then the final era, which is the current era of the greater occultation, when there is a hidden Imam with no mediation, no agents mediating for him. These divisions, the lesser and greater occultation, are often treated as historical eras, but I would say this is a mistake. We should really treat this as a doctrinal formation and not a historical periodization. And certainly the people who were living through these moments were not clearly aware of this, and the establishment of these divisions was made only gradually. So coming back to my original question, why was this idea of occultation accepted? The traditional answer is that in contrast to appearances, a child was born, a son of al-Hasan al-Askari, but he went into hiding because of fear of government persecution. When modern historians have discussed the Twelver occultation, it is usually described in terms of its various doctrinal precedents. In a seminal 1976 article, Eitan Kohlberg analyzed the doctrinal transition from an Imami community with a living Imam to the Twelver community with a hidden Imam. Towards the end of the article, Kohlberg moved beyond this kind of history of ideas approach and gave a couple of suggestions as to why it might have occurred. The first one is persecution. Quote, Ithna Ashari claims that the Imam's life was often at peril might well be accepted at face value. And the second is political expediency. He suggests that the failure of Shi'i revolution made the Imami elite turn towards accommodation with governments. Quote, for them, the disappearance of the Imam held obvious political and doctrinal attractions. In due course, it enabled the Imamis to recognize and cooperate with the pro-Shi'i Buwayhid regime. Now, this might be true, but these are sort of ex post facto explanations, or the second one is, this is why the occultation was useful thereafter, why it made sense and it was a successful doctrinal formation thereafter, not the reason why it occurred. And neither of these suggestions explains why a group would take the strange step of removing their leader and replacing him with the idea of a hidden Imam, nor why they did so at this moment when persecution had been going on for several generations. Moreover, Kohlberg seems to imply that the occultation was produced by a rational, even a cynical calculation of outcomes. Instead, I would argue that the occultation occurred not because it was planned to achieve a particular outcome, but because of the way actors were channeled by the structural dynamics of imamate and community at that time. Since Kohlberg's offering, there has been little in the way of answering this question. Indeed, scholars tend to start from the plain fact that the occultation did happen and then proceed to analyze the aftermath. A quote from Said Arjuman's article, The Consolation of Theology, is typical of the way the occultation has been approached. Arjuman writes, quote, when the 11th Imam, Hasan al-Askari, died, the scholars of the community had to assure the survival of Imami Shi'ism despite the removal of its main pillar, the Imam. I will repeat, despite the removal of the Imam. The removal of the Imam, who removed the Imam? He was not removed. One Imam died and was not replaced. The imamate was a social institution that served the needs of a community. If no new Imam was designated by that community, then we need to ask not only how the community coped with the occultation, but why they allowed the occultation to occur in the first place. The topic needs to be handled in a different way and with more precise set of questions. In particular, we should understand why the brother of Al-Hasan was rejected as the only visible candidate for Imam. Why did the occultation idea emerge as a solution and how was it canonized? And who had the power to influence these processes? Or to put it a different way, the reasons for the occultation were a matter of authority. Who had authority and how was authority manifested in practice? Hitherto, these questions, if addressed at all, have been addressed as questions of intellectual history. To get a clearer sense of the nature of the battleground where these issues were fought, here is a map. A map for the geographical origin of people who claim to have seen the hidden Imam. Red for agents, green for lay people. Now, this is not a perfect representation. It just gives us general sense of where the pro-occultation faction were located based on these early sources, just as a starting point. It's important to note that this community was a scattered minority with strongholds in these various places, what Newman calls pockets of believers. In particular, the axis between Samarra and Baghdad in Iraq and Qom in Iran was central to the new occultation faction. Within this, though, who had the authority? We can look at a number of different actors, and these are very much overlapping. You see, you can identify individuals who belong to several groups or just a single group. The family and household of the Imam, the agents of the Imam, scholars and theologians, and Hadith transmitters. And I've tried to outline some of where these overlaps occur. In early reports about the occultation, we see that all of these groups assert their own particular kind of power and authority in different ways. The Twelver tradition is clear that it was the agents who were able to establish their authority, ultimately. Here are the names of the 4 canonical agents, who came to be known as the envoys, the Safir, Sufara of the hidden Imam. That means the envoys or the emissaries. Now, the traditional model of these envoys is that they succeeded one to the next smoothly. Here's a sort of visual representation. So there's no break in between them. There's no problem. There's no contestation. That's the sort of traditional narrative of succession. And this smooth model of succession supports a sense that in spite of the apparent chaos and fragmentation, at its heart, a core of the community continued to be divinely guided. Modern scholars of the occultation have tended to broadly accept this model of smooth succession. Hossein Modarresi, for example, is a careful, critical scholar, but leaves the image of a smooth succession of the envoys more or less intact. A rare skeptic is Verena Clem, who rejects the Twelver model wholesale, suggesting that the 2 first envoys held no such positions of authority, and that the idea of the agentship, the envoyship, was concocted by the 3rd envoy and his cronies. I would suggest that we should neither accept the Twelver doctrine at face value nor throw away the tradition entirely. The 12 Hadith sources on the occultation have been assembled into mosaic assemblages, which together suggest a picture of clean succession. However, if we disassemble the mosaic and study the individual tesserae, the individual stories, we can see that the picture is reassuringly complex and includes a wealth of detail which is inconsistent with later orthodoxy. And this led me to something like this as a visual representation of how I see the chronology of the establishment of the authority of the agents. I won't go into all of the details, you can read the book for that, but a key aspect that I will highlight is that after Al-Hasan al-Askari's death, the 1st envoy does not appear to participate in the institutional mechanisms of the early occultation at all. And there are lots of little bits and pieces of evidence. So he was visible as an important agent before the occultation, but he's not really there as an agent of the hidden Imam very clearly in the early sources. The 2nd envoy, yes, he was there, but his authority was gradually established and it was certainly contested. The 3rd envoy, his authority seems to have been more broadly accepted. And the 4th envoy, however, had minimal practical authority. There seemed to have been no consensus, real consensus around his authority, and he died only after 2 years. So it's a more complex picture. However, I do think that they had an important historical role. And so what did they owe their authority to? A traditional view of the Imam's relationship with his followers via his agents might be something like this. Everything emanates from the Imam. The agents do his bidding. They deliver the Imam's letters, decrees, legal and theological instructions, as well as gifts and blessings to favored followers. But this image, again, is too simple. Both during the lifetime of the Imam and after, we should understand the community also as acting themselves to define the Imamate. After the death of the 11th Imam, for example, we have several versions of a story in which a delegation is sent by the community of Qom to try and find out who the new Imam is. They first approach the obvious candidate, Ja'far, the brother of Al-Hassan. Now this story of the Qummi delegation is told in various versions, and in one that appears in Khasibi's Al-Hidayah Al-Kubra goes like this. And the people of Qom gathered, and they wrote Ja'far a letter, including it questions which they asked him, and they said, answer these questions, Masail, just as our forefathers asked your forefathers, which they answered with responses which we have kept, and which we take as a source of emulation, and which we act in accordance with. Answer them as your earlier forefathers answered them, so that we may carry to you the dues, i.e. the canonical taxes, which we used to carry to them. But Ja'far did not answer them, nor the letter at all, ever. End quote. Thus was Ja'far's imamate rejected by the Qummi delegation. This episode tells us several important things. Firstly, there were reciprocal expectations between the Imam and the community. And secondly, the Imam's legitimacy was actively tested and verified by the community. In terms of these reciprocal expectations, we see that though money was sent to the Imams, there was an expectation that in turn the Imam would provide guidance, he would answer their questions, he would guarantee their salvation. And this was a relationship that the community wanted to continue. The delegation report makes it clear that the community wanted to continue paying. They did not just keep their money and go back to Qom. They tried to find someone else to give their money to, for the imamate filled an important ritual and soteriological function for them. We might, though I sometimes compare the alms tax, the zakat and the khums to governmental taxation, this is a very important difference that you know, the people are actively desire to pay their taxes, their alms taxes to the Imam. And then in terms of this test of legitimacy, the Imam's legitimacy is tested based on his ability to reproduce the statements of earlier Imams, or reduce the legal rulings, the theological rulings of earlier Imams, that the Imami traditionists have preserved both in memory and in their books. So the Imam's agency is limited by the epistemic authority of Hadith transmitters as guardians of established knowledge. This means we should also entertain another model of authority. In this version, it is the local communities that confer authority on the Imam through a process of regional consensus, which was mediated by local agents. Note that in both diagrams, the role of intermediary is crucial. The agents appointed by the Imam or the delegates sent from the local communities play a key role. Often we see that these middlemen are negotiated from both ends. Both the community and the Imam come to a compromise over who should represent one to the other. But on the death of the 11th Imam, these traditional lines of communication are interrupted, both top down and bottom up. And the holders of authority in the community split into factions. The quarrel between the two brothers divided all sets of stakeholders. There was no quiet core of consensus. The family of the Imams was split. The brother and the mother of the dead Imam quarreled over his inheritance. Different scholars and theologians backed different solutions to the crisis. Even those who agreed that Ja'far was not the Imam could not initially agree on an alternative. However, within this chaos, the agents of the 11th Imam retained some of their old prestige, and some continued to operate. But when these old guard agents began to die, it proved difficulty to reproduce their authority without a visible Imam. Thus, for example, one source preserves the accusation of a skeptical agent, Ahmad ibn Hilal al-Karhi, who reportedly said, quote, "I did not hear him," by which he means the Imam al-Hasan al-Askari, "I did not hear him designate the second envoy, Abu Ja'far, for the agentship, but I do not deny his father. But as for stating with certainty that Abu Ja'far is the agent of the Lord of the age, i.e. the hidden Imam, well, I do not dare to." End quote. Ibn Hilal would not only accept an agent, would only accept an agent directly appointed by a living Imam. If his position had been accepted, then there would have been no reproduction of the authority of the agents once the old generation died out. But the envoys of the hidden Imam responded by mobilizing the symbols and institutions of the imamate. We are told that when the first envoy died, quote, "Letters came appointing the second envoy to his office in the handwriting in which they had corresponded with the Imam before." In the continuation of this report, the hidden Imam is said to write, "And the son," that is Abu Ja'far al-Amri, the second envoy, may God protect him, "was always our trustworthy agent during the lifetime of the father. And the son commands from our command, and he acts according to it. May God befriend him." End quote. To this might seem a little circular. Why would you believe a letter appointing the issuer of that letter? And why would you believe in an invisible Imam whose existence was proved by the man who was only appointed by such a letter? To understand how this works, we have to understand the institutional context of these letters. The agents were able to embody the Imamic idiom because they had emerged from these Imamic institutions, what we might call an Imamic Chancery. The style of the hidden Imam's letter of appointment reproduces the style from pre-occultation days. But it is not just a matter of style. Also, the physicality of these letters was scrutinized by the Imami community. Handwriting is often mentioned as evidence for the hidden Imam. Another report tells us that when the third envoy acceded to his office, he was formally given the seals of the Imam. When we think about it, this makes perfect sense. A seal was a potent symbol of authority that also appears in anecdotes regarding governmental administration of the time. Seals were, moreover, not just abstract symbols, but were actively employed in the production of the physical traces of the imamate upon the letters which were distributed to the community. So the occultation agents used a number of different means of control, adapted from practices that were current during the lifetime of the Imams. They form the basis of what I'm calling the Imamic Chancery. And there's a little list of taken together, these protocols were what embodied the Imam for most of the community, both before and after the occultation. Even without a visible Imam then, the agents could project a sense of continuity through these mechanisms. Crucial to recognize is that in all periods, the imamate was mediated. We need to consider the mechanisms of mediation to understand how the historical imamate operated. In spite of the attempts to project the image of continuity, the Imami Shi'a still felt the ambivalence of the new situation. This resulted in a new terminology to describe the Imamic Chancery in the period of the occultation. And the word that we see in these early sources is an-nahiya. This is sometimes translated as the holy threshold in the secondary literature, but I think this translation is nonsense. There are two key facts about the word an-nahiya that have not been noted. Firstly, it is not a term that was applied to the imamate in the pre-occultation period. I've only found one instance where I found an-nahiya applied to pre-occultation agents, and that's clearly back projected. Secondly, by using this term, we can see that the Imam is not named, but he is implicitly conflated with the institutions that represent him. This is exactly what the agents needed, a word which did not make explicit claims, but seemed to associate them with continuing institutions of imamate. The exact meaning is mysterious. The word nahya means side, corner, or region. In this period, however, it was also used in the sense of the faction or the party, nahid bugha, for example, the retinue of a great man. I think this is what it means here. The nahya are the occultation faction attached to the hidden imam, or perhaps attached to the envoy himself. The appearance of this word at this moment indicates how vocabularies were changing to reflect the ambivalence of the new situation. The Imami Shiʿi clearly noticed this and found ways of dealing with the ambivalence of their leadership. In one report, we hear of a certain man bringing a petition to the agent in Baghdad. He waits a few days and then becomes anxious when there is no reply. But his friend reassures him, suggesting that a delayed response is a good sign, saying, quote, "I prefer that, because when the response is prompt, it originates from the envoy. And if it takes a long time, then it comes from the Lord, Sahib, i.e. the Imam." In this report, we catch an unusually clear glimpse of individuals trying to reconcile their need to believe with the clear sense of uncertainty about who they are believing in. So, to draw some conclusions and to return to our original question, why did the occultation occur? Any answer needs to combine the insights from the political, the doctrinal, and the institutional fields of action. For all three of these were the fields in which authority was legitimated. In the political field, the conflict between Hassan and Ja'far split both the family and the wider community. Such splits had happened many times before, but on this occasion, the pro-Hassan agents were so bitterly opposed to Ja'far that they refused to work with him, even if it meant having no imam. The very core of the community was split and consensus was impossible, at least for a couple of generations. In this earliest phase, key actors competed to control the narrative based on their different kinds of authority: hereditary, bureaucratic, epistemic, and authority by association. The core of the new consensus was gradually forged between pro-occultation agents centered in Baghdad and the Hadith collectors of Qom. The epistemic authority of the Hadith collectors was used as a touchstone to test and to reject Ja'far, but they still wanted and needed an imam. This was not a cynical calculation, but a religious need for ritual continuity. But vested interests also played a role. The big men of Qom and other regional communities owed much of their own prestige to their links with the imamate. So the disintegration of a centralized imamate was a threat to vested interests, both at the center and on the periphery. In the doctrinal field, existing orthodoxy insisted that there could not be a break in the imamate. So there had to be an imam out there somewhere. If he was not visible, then he had to be a hidden imam. But why did the Twelver occultation doctrine succeed in the longer term? It was viable because the agents were embedded in the protocols of the Imamic Chancery. They controlled the means of representing the imamate. They were the middlemen between the imam and his followers. This allowed them to assert a plausible image of continuity to the community which persisted beyond the first generation of crisis and fragmentation. So just to then think about where this leaves us. I think this is an approach that is new. In general, it's new for early Shi'ism, for early Imami Shi'ism in particular, which has hitherto seen very few attempts at really thoroughgoing social history. I would say Ismaili studies is a bit further on in this matter. Equally, I would say that I think this approach is provides useful insights for doing early Islamic history. I hope it does. The revisionist challenge to the validity of traditional narrative sources for Islamic history led to a proliferation of studies that attempt to sideline questions of historical fact to focus instead of narrative meanings and historical memory. And in general, this is a trend I applaud and has produced very, very healthy readings of our sources. So for example, in his very nice article on Karbala, Antoine Bourou writes, quote, "One could even concur with the German Egyptologist Jan Assmann that before studying the past as such, we must study the past as it is remembered," end quote. Now, I don't have a problem with his sentiment, but I'm just going to split hairs a moment and take exception with that little word before. The recognition of the rhetorical function of the sources, as I say, has been healthy, but I think we cannot study narrative and memory before attempting to reconstruct plausible models for what social institutions in society looked like. These institutions provided the channels through which narratives circulated. Narratives can be manipulated, but only within concrete societal frameworks. Whether ideas circulated on sealed parchment letters or on Twitter, as they do now, determines much about how these narratives can be embedded in society. I think you couldn't read and understand a history of or a current political history of the last 2 or 3 years without knowing what Twitter is. Some things just wouldn't make sense. And so I think we need to think of that mechanical, that process of mediation and institutional channels to understand all historical periods. And so there has to be a kind of give and take, a dance between the reconstruction of facts, the modeling of factual situations, and the modeling of how narratives might have circulated in them. The occurrence of the occultation is one moment when we can clearly study the social mechanisms through which narratives are produced and contested. Anyone can invent a story, but not anyone can embed a narrative in a community as dominant. To do that, you need institutions like those of the agents and the Qumi Hadith collectors. And that's all for now. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ed, for this wonderful presentation. It's I'm really looking forward to the book now. I will maybe give the floor to Karen Bauer if you want to react.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Ed. I really very much enjoyed that talk, and I feel that I learned some things as well, which is always a great benefit. Now you talked in the beginning about the end of a line of religious leaders and why that would happen. And one might say that in this case, we're talking about the end of a certain type of authority, right? And a migration of that authority to others, right? And the migration of the claims to authority being adopted by others that are, it's interesting to me how the agents are claiming the authority of the imams, and yet the imams are, not there. So I was thinking of the other types of authority with other claims to divine guidance that might have been going on at the time. And I mean, you mentioned the different groups, of course. And in that regard, because I feel that lots of people really position themselves as intermediaries in medieval Islamic society. I mean, certainly the ulama, however we construe them, in different genres of text are constantly positioning themselves as intermediaries of some kind and drawing direct lines back according to some version of succession, while albeit not the same version of succession that we're talking about here. So with regard to the envoys, I'm just wondering, I mean, who were they? Can you say any more about who they actually were? it seems that they got their authority, or they got their claims to authority by claiming appointment from the imams in some cases, or by, but I'm wondering if there was anything else in terms of the social history that you could enlighten us with. I mean, were there any ties of marriage? Were they from prominent families? Do we know anything about them at all, or do we know nothing about them? All of that, I think, would be very interesting. Let's see. I guess that what I wanted to say next is that I think that it's just on a side or parallel or track, is that it is interesting to me how occultation works, or if you might say a few words about how occultation works in parallel tradition. So I'm thinking about the Mustatli Ismailis, who are now the Bohras. And interestingly enough, right now in the Bohra community, you may or may not know about their succession debate that's going on right now. And so I do think that these questions that you're asking are super important, because we can even see them being played out in the present day stage. And then to pick up on one of the last points that you were making, which I really, really appreciated, about how the sources might function in terms of historical memory, but also in terms of establishing claims to authority and establishing a certain vision of what actually happened, right? So I noticed that a lot of your letters came from Tusi's Ghaiba, and what kinds of competing claims might that work actually be representing? Because I noticed that one of the letters establishing the authority for Abu Ja'far al-Amri came from there, but also it seemed that a report doubting his authority came from there. And so I'm just wondering, can we say anything about how those historical sources are functioning and are positioning these claims to authority? And any other things that you can say about the sources for the letters that you've been using? I mean, are they reliable? How are the letters themselves situated in the historical sources, and what function might they play in those historical sources? How are the letters even written, and what could that tell us? You know, of course, that I'm interested in emotion. Is there emotive language that's used in these letters, or is there not emotive language used in these letters? How are the way that these are written positioning them as factual or counterfactual sources, or can we even say that from what we know? And so those were my questions, and thank you again for a brilliant talk. Very much enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for some great questions. So I'll take them one by one as you asked them. First of all, just to acknowledge that it's very, this question about the migration authority that you started with, and you put very well, and it's useful to acknowledge that first, actually, because it's, what we're talking about is basically all of these fall in both in the Sunni and the Shi'i and Ibadi and early Islam in general cases. Is we're thinking about how God reaches mankind, how divine guidance reaches mankind. So all of there is no great split between Sunni and Shia. Somebody has to do that job of mediation, and that can be thought of in terms of intellectual history, and it can be thought of institutions for, that come in and step and do the work of mediation. Which is why I like to think about the Dalai Lama and the Vatican. It'd be very strange if the Pope announced the end of the papacy. There's not going to be another Pope after me. And the Vatican, you can imagine the people in the Vatican would be extremely upset. There's all these huge institutions. Now, the institutions in my period, I don't think are so, they're clearly not nearly so long. They haven't got such long historical roots. They're not so formal. They're not so well established as the Vatican, for example, or the Dalai Lama, for that matter. And they're influenced both by the doctrine affects the way the institutions are formulated, but vice versa as well. And I'd be interested to do more thinking about how, for example, you know, inheritance practices affect the doctrine of the imamate. Is that I'm not, you know, I've started thinking about that. I haven't seen any very good way of sort of starting to answer that question, though, of course, there's things about inheritance scattered out throughout the sources. Yeah, and then so when you're thinking about how institutions fall between God and man, then yes, you can very easily start thinking about, you know, what kind of religious leader was it Ibn Hanbal? What kind of leader, what religious leader, you know, is the guy at the local mosque? You know, is how much authority, actual authority, does the fact that on paper a particular religious leader might be very, you know, very religiously powerful, have very powerful authority, on how much is that actually more of a negotiation? How much is that an ideal picture? And some of that comes out in these kind of sources. As to who the envoys were, for the first two, we don't really know. There's not much there. The biographies just say something very short, like Khadama al-Imam, you know, he served the Imam. Does that mean he was a khadim, like a servant? Like, or was he, they don't seem to have, the first two don't seem to have much scholarly output, other than just, you know, he wrote this down from the Imam. Which is why I've been trying to divide, it's a little bit tricky, but I've been trying to divide as roles, the role of scholar, which I've been categorizing as an author of known books, and a non-scholar, or you may be hadith transmitter. But so I see the agent as a kind of professional category, but it overlaps with these other things. Obviously, if you're an agent from the Imam, you're also kind of transmitting hadith from him. So that, you know, but you're not, I don't think you're quite a scholarly hadith, necessarily a scholarly hadith transmitter with a, you know, with a whole row of books on your shelf and producing new works, you know, repackaging hadith and putting them in new ways for the needs of the community. So they're not that, I don't think. They were there in Samarra with the imams in their, you know, house arrest, as it's called. The third envoy, though, suddenly we have someone who's a bit more in the historical eye. He was a courtier. He was pretty powerful and influential person at court. He was a member of the Naubakhti family, which is a famous family of theologians in the Imami community, tracing its heritage back to an astrologer at the court of Harun al-Rashid, maybe, one of the early Abbasid caliphs. And had converted to Imami Shi'ism at some point. So they're a prominent family. The envoy is not a major one, it's not one of these major theologians, though there is a source, there is a narrative, a question that says, why didn't this very prominent, famous theologian Naubakhti become the envoy to the Imam? And the answer is, because he's too prominent, he's too, you know, the envoy has to go around and do secretive things. Whereas theologians are all talk, you know, their job is to talk a lot. And so it's a different kind of skill set. Another interesting thing is that the daughter, the second envoy, the one who I think really is the first envoy, his daughter married the third envoy. So I don't know if that happened after or before, you know, whether that was the result of an alliance or that was the means to an alliance. But it means that there are sort of political things going on in the community that are semi-visible. The parallel with the Bohras is very interesting. And then it comes back to this thing about the relationship between institutions and sort of socio-political events and doctrines and ideas. I think the doctrines of the Bohras with their hidden Imam are close enough to the early Imami Shi'a that we have some repeat patterns, history repeating itself a bit. Once you have a hidden imam, then you have, you know, so the Buhras have a da'i mutlaq, so the imamic pronouncements are delegated down the line, or down the sort of pyramid thing. And I think that could have happened in the case of the agents, but it didn't become permanent for one thing or another. But yeah, so I think I think that's an institutional patterning that is somewhat determined by doctrinal, well, conception, ideas, let's call it.
Yeah, that was the exact parallel that I was thinking about.
But it's difficult to say, and it's dangerous, I guess, to say that, you know, you don't want to be saying doctrine produces a certain political, and indeed that with Al-Juman's a little bit that way. You know, Al-Juman does a lot of interesting things to say, but he's a bit like that. You know, Al-Juman conflates millennial sort of ghulu kind of ideas. Moshe knows better than me with militancy, which is, that just doesn't make sense. You know. Letters and the functioning of sources. So you know that what I've been doing at Leiden involves letters, and so you picked on the letters. Not all my sources are letters, a lot of them are oral accounts of oral events, that sort of thing. I am very interested in the letters because I think it does show what, it shows the agents acting as agents in a way that other actors can't necessarily do that, reproduce the imamic authority in the same way. The mother of the imam, of Al-Hasan al-Askari, was very prominent in the early period, but she wasn't going around producing letters and you know, showing, here's my letter of appointment from the previous imam. So I think that does, you know, that's where that and certainly for emotion, yes, you could do interesting things with that. There are very emotive denunciations of Ja'far al-Kadhab, right? Ja'far, he's called al-Kadhab, so you know that there's an emotive language going on there. And also the letters of appointment, I think, you can see an emotional framework, I guess, with this thiqa ma'moon, you know, it's all about, don't worry, he's my trusted one, he's, you know, it's continuity, that kind of thing. So that I haven't done that, but definitely you could do that. And then finally about, and the functioning of narrative sources, as you very perceptively pointed out, that the sources, or hinted at the fact that the sources that I'm using to reconstruct the events, the political history, were themselves arguments about that history. And so I'm trying to disentangle that. And there are, you know, the way I do that is if a number of sources that seem to be opposed to each other, or not sources, narratives, right? I'm taking narratives which broadly come from the Twelver tradition, and I'm deconstructing them to take a single narrative by itself to say, well, what was this responding to? And if all of them say, well, for example, this pregnant concubine whose pregnancy was disproven, it's an odd story to put around from the point of view of later orthodoxy, because the Twelvers did say that there was a concubine who did have the hidden imam, the 11th imam's child, but before she had it before the death of the 11th imam. So if that was the case, why would a story about a pregnant concubine, posthumously pregnant concubine, be circulated? Which suggests that maybe there is something in this story. And the Abbasids got involved. I've certainly, you know, it's certainly fascinating if it did happen, you know. But of course, the argument that they're trying to prove is that the imam had to hide because of this horrible persecution, right? So that's the argument that narrative about the concubine is involved. They look how nosy and aggressively intervening the Abbasids are. They're even, you know, keeping this concubine under house arrest, and therefore it had to have been hidden. There had to be a hidden imam, because that's this.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how the treatment of women becomes this kind of way of expressing the I don't know, in some cases like the horribleness of a regime because of look at what they do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, by the way. Thank you. That was great. And that was exactly the question that I was asking about the sources. It was exactly about that. Yeah. But I'll let others go now.
Thank you, Karen. Moshe, would you like to?
Yes, thank you so much, Ed. A very illuminating talk. And I should say that I've read your previous work, so this was sort of epitomized your contribution to the field and several very important points that you make. Now, I would like to make several comments about your contribution and its importance in methodological terms, and also propose several questions that might perhaps in the future help enhance the line of research that you are pursuing. If you could answer them now, great. If not, just food for thought for the future. Well, first of all, I really applaud your very meticulous approach to studying Twelver Shi'a, but also more broadly sectarian history in the Islamic Middle East. And the reason is that usually, customarily, scholars approach this or that sectarian group as ready-made categories, sort of in a heresiographical fashion. You know, this guy is a Zaydi, this guy is an Imami, this guy is a Sunni, therefore they did this or that. So there is always a sectarian explanation. A community is assumed to have been formed by doctrine, and people's actions are explained through their adherence to this or that doctrine. Whereas what you do is you meticulously explore the very nitty-gritty social and economic and political realities in which agents operated and which informed their actions and words and ideas that they circulated. And this brings me to the second point, namely, you very convincingly show that religious doctrine very often, if not always, is a vehicle for promoting certain political and social interests and advancing certain agenda. And I find your approach very convincing and very detailed. The third point relates to your use of Hadith, and Karen asked you about your use of sources. I think anyone who has worked with Hadith material in terms of historiography will find it extremely bewildering, especially the Shi'i Hadith tradition, because it's so much more diverse in terms of content. There is lots of legal Hadith, there are reports on doctrine, there are reports on historical accounts, and it can drive a person crazy trying to make sense of it. And I think you do a great job in trying to find historical threads and actually, through very careful reading, trying to show that, you know, Hadith A, B, C, and D show that actually there is this historical process happening, and those other Hadith show something else. And I think that's a good check on this very skeptical approach to Hadith as a historical source, and that you show that Hadith actually can be used as a historical source if approached carefully. Now, and finally, to the last point that you made regarding to the methodological question whether we should study events or memories, and I cannot agree with you more. I have not read Antoine Boru's article, but I very much agree that we should not study either memory or events. It's not a zero-sum game, but we should, to be able to study memory, first of all, we should know the historical context in which memories have been generated, circulated, and perpetuated and transmitted from generation to generation. This cannot be done without actually knowing the social and political and institutional environment in which these memories have been circulated and generated. So this is very much, these two endeavors one cannot be undertaken without the other. So just to note that I agree with you on this point. Now, some questions that might enhance your line of work. And again, if you want to answer them, great. If not, just treat this as food for thought. Now, question number one, when you study the practices of authority within the Imami community, and by this I mean, how did a person go about asserting their authority, whether an imam or an agent or an envoy or a collector of the dues? What type of discursive or other practices did they use in anthropological terms? And how did this tie in with the broader situation in the Abbasid Empire? You seem to answer the first part of the question, but I wonder if this is part of, some of these practices were part of a broader pattern that were used across different communities. The Imamis did not live in a vacuum, so they must have tapped into broader discursive and other practices prevalent in the society at the time. So I would like to see a broader picture of practices of authority employed by representatives of the Imam or the Imam himself or the envoys, etc., different stakeholders. The second is regards to the idea of secrecy. Now, of course, you show how the idea of occultation came around and the institutional and political context. And of course, the idea of secrecy itself and hiddenness itself can have a very powerful political value. Sometimes people create a secret out of nothing to create an aura of authority. I wonder if that could be pursued further. There is a very important article by Hugh Urban. I forget the title, but it's published in History of Religions, about how in certain communities, the idea of secrecy itself is a vehicle to creating some sort of symbolic capital for the community that practices it. And very often they're not really hiding anything in particular, but the very fact that something is hidden and they have the sole access to it is already creates some sort of symbolic capital for them. And finally, I wonder if something could be said about the broader sectarian picture of the time. Now, of course, this is a period when the Ismailis are coming onto the historical stage, the Qarmatis and the Fatimids in North Africa. And yeah, I see Fârès nodding and smiling. I wonder if something could be said about that. Was there any awareness in the Imami community? Were they in any way openly or not very openly polemicizing? There's some discussion of this in Omid Ghaem Maghami's recent book about encounters with the hidden Imam. And I also would like to see whether this polemic and this awareness or lack of awareness played a role in the Imami community and in their practices of authority and in general, how this related to the types of practices and discourses that circulated in the Imami community at the time. I will stop here. I wonder what you think about these issues.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for your very, generous reading of my contribution and really very interesting questions. Well, I'll maybe go backwards this time. in terms of the Ismaili, the awareness of the Ismailis, it's pretty hard to see. I think there's maybe more in the Ismaili literature than there is in the Twelver literature. And so I think it's Mansour al-Yaman's biography, is it, where he says, I was 12 and I converted when I met the Ismaili Imam by the Furat and that sort of thing.
Ibn Hawshab.
Ibn Hawshab, yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, his nickname was also Mansour al-Yaman, absolutely.
Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah, okay. So, so you have things like that, occasional mentions of conversion. And you know, other figures, Qadi Nu'man, who, you know, biographically we see a sort of Twelver or a Imami background. In the early Twelver literature, you do also see Ismaili responses to Ismailis, and I haven't looked deeply into it. Sometimes as well, we have Mulhid in Ibn Babuya's Kamal ad-Din. So here's a response to a mulhid, and I don't know, is that an Ismaili? Probably, right? But maybe it's just some other naughty person. Yeah, the sources, you'd have to dig around to find some sources, but I'm sure that some interesting work could be done there, which I haven't done. Other than just, you know, it's been noted that it must be make a difference, right? Oh, you do see it a bit later when the envoy ship is a bit more established, and you know, you have the caliphate declining in Baghdad, and you have these Shi'i viziers who are also prominent in both in the Imami, the new Twelver community and in the Abbasid court, and they sort of use the influence in one area to leverage influence in another. You do see people accused of being, you know, Ismaili. I think, is it Ibn al-Furat and his son are called the I can't remember the phrase. The great, it's not al-Ismaili al-Akbar or al-Ismaili al-Asghar, what are they called? Anyway, whatever it is, but that's not really, so that's not quite close to my question, which is really in the early period of the Twelvers, and also the early, and I think close to what your question is. I don't see the Ismailis there. I see the, you know, Ibn Nusayr and, you know, Ishaq al-Ahmar there, you know, but they're not really explicitly, but maybe they are. I think you could read and try and figure out if they're implicitly addressing what the Ismailis are doing in that.
Well, and Nawbakhti has a chapter on the Ismailis, and he's
yes.
writing it right in the middle of the lesser occultation.
Yes, and so the
Sa'd ibn Abdullah al-Qummi.
Yeah, and Nu'mani, who writes the first monograph on the occultation, very soon after the end of the greater occultation. So he has a chapter on, what is it? The followers of Ismail, I think he calls it. But that's all very, you know, here's a hadith, here's a hadith, here's a hadith, here's a hadith, to, you know, so clearly there's a debate going on, but it's difficult to know how it's structured. Because what I do is I sort of ignore the purely doctrinal ones. I quite like it. Quite like the hadith where it says, I was in somebody's house and this guy came in and he said, and he belonged to this doctrine. And then I said, yeah, but what about this? I quite like those ones. And then we have a doctrinal discussion. But something where it's just, here's a list, you know, here's all the hadith on our side against their one. Those are little more difficult for me to deal with. In terms of the secrecy question,
sorry,
again,
since we were talking about the Ismailis and you mentioned also Ibn Nusayr and Ishaq al-Ahmar, so I had just maybe a question on this same topic. I mean, it's very interesting that in the same period, you have what could be called rival hierarchical networks, right? So the agents of the Imams, the Ismaili Dawah, which is already operating and seems to have, begun to have great successes immediately after the occultation. So and also the networks are of the Abwabs, or the charismatic leaders. So I mean, there's a whole environment of these rival claims to spiritual legitimacy. So the question I would ask is, how do you think all these networks are connected to each other, or are they connected to each other? I mean, for example, the Ismailis were probably in the eyes of the community that you're working on, outsiders, right? They're Shia, but they're not part of the exact same community. But the proto-Nusayris, where there might be considered as insiders or dissidents somehow of the same community, right? And there's also at least a fourth group there, which is the late Jabirian community, as shown by a recent article by Leonardo Capizone, which is entitled "The Solitude of the Orphan, Jabir ibn Hayyan and the Shiite heterodox milieu of the 9th, 10th centuries." So there you have all these groups which all claim spiritual legitimacy in a Shi'i context, but some are really discussing with each other, because you always discuss more with the people who are closer to you, right? So you don't need to fight someone that is completely outside your community. You always fight people from within, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, how do you picture this whole
yeah, it's something we should sit down together, and all of us, and think a bit more in, because I think it's, maybe we could do something with geographical, rather, as you say, it would be interesting to look where people are and at what time, and make a big table. So as you say, my guys talk about Ibn Nusayr and the Imami Ghulat, because what does it mean to be Imami? It means that you do walaya to the same Imam. So that's you belong to a kind of symbolic community that's defined by this. And there's a broader community, because in fact, you might have done wilaya to the same, this current Imam's father, and then split after that. So and then those can maybe merge again. So I don't know whether the Ismailis are, going back to Ismail, and Muhammad ibn, not Ismail, going back to Ja'far as-Sadiq, then does the fact that Ismailis and Twelvers both recognize Ja'far as-Sadiq count for anything in terms of communal boundary or actual lived experience? Like, are these people living in the same quarters and that kind of thing, or the same towns and villages, or do you have a village of their, in whichever, difficult to say. And I think the Ismaili material is, I don't know, like, do you think the early Ismaili material has enough detail in the 9th century to clearly plot who they are? The most I've read on this is Hollenberg's book, which has a very nice first couple of chapters that does some of that. But can you plot where people are? And
no, it's very hard to say, because this literature, you don't really have historical accounts until Qadi Nu'man, which is not much later, but which is after the events in any case.
Yeah.
So
the Nusayri, I mean, the Nusayri material and the Silsilat al-Turath material that Mushaykh has been working on is a really good place to look. And you yourself, right? And I think it's like Hidayah al-Kubra as a work that is, you know, a sort of ghulat, but in a little bit of taqiyya, is very interesting because it shows discussions between, you know, different wings of this Imami community. But I wonder, do they, Mushaykh, how much conversation is there between the early Ismailis and the Proto-Nusayris in the 9th century, late 9th century, late 8th century?
Yeah,
late 9th century.
I think there is more on the Ismaili side than on the Nusayri side. I haven't really seen any references or any open references to the Ismaili by the Nusayris or the Proto-Nusayris, whereas in Kitab al-Kash, there is a sort of a refutation of some Proto-Nusayri teachings and sort of an attempt to distance the Ismailis from those Proto-Nusayris. There is also material in Basair al-Darajat, Safar al-Qummis, but not against the Nusayris, but it's sort of a Proto-Nusayri or Ghulat material that exonerates some of the Ghulat against accusations by the Imamis or by the non-Ghulat at least. So
right.
I have an article forthcoming on this, but I don't, the Proto-Nusayris don't really, I haven't seen any, at least in the references that I know that engage with the Ismailis.
Yeah.
But a lot of the early Fatimid literature is clearly a reinterpretation of Nusayri themes and proto-Nusayri themes, if you like. Especially on the ta'wil of religious rituals.
Yeah.
And also, yes, and also Ismaili literature in Syria, or we don't know if it's Ismaili or Nusayri. There is lots of textual interpolations where there is an Ismaili text with a clearly Nusayri fragment, or a Nusayri text, for example, Kitab al-Haft, one of their major works, and appended to it is an introduction which speaks of Jad, Fath, and Khayal, which are very clearly Ismaili ideas, but it's appended later, so it's unclear. And my theory is that, well, they lived in very, very close proximity, and then some of the Nusayri centers were conquered by the Nizaris, so lots of this textual heritage came into possession of of both communities, so there was lots of copying back and forth.
Yeah. So it's a bit later. But I mean, as well, there's Al-Hallaj, right? Al-Hallaj exists in, you know, is clearly called out by At-Tusi in Kitab al-Ghaiba as one of these bad guys who claims babhood. And he's not, well, I don't know. He's not really Imami, is he? He's one of the guys who's around, and he's a sort of religious entrepreneur who, you know, who, at least the way he appears in the Imami source, who's looking for a context to embed his authority, which again, you know, it's interesting, you know, what Mushaykh you said about trying to avoid assuming pre-existent identities. It's fascinating to think that unless this is just a slur, right, that this is this insincere guy who's got no religious principles. But it's interesting to think, well, is the society cosmopolitan enough that you don't need to be rooted in, you know, the religion of your family and that sort of thing, or else shift and marry into a different context, or that sort of thing? Can you be somewhat fluid, making things up as you go along a bit and finding followers? that would suggest perhaps yes.
And yes, that's true. First of all, it was very fluid, very cosmopolitan, and this idea of hard and fast boundaries between the Imamis and all the wrong types of Shi'is, so to say, is a very laid back projection. We have reports about wazirs, the Karkhiyun, for example, who served some of the caliphs, who espoused some of the teachings of the non-Orthodox Imamis in the late 900s, and so
yeah.
And I was very interested by something you said, that in all periods the imamate was mediated, so that and that somehow the structure that was put in place after the occultation pre-existed, right? So to what degree can we say that this structure that outlived the occultation was challenged by rival claims from within or from outside? I mean, was it possible that were there any challengers to the second envoy, who you believe was the first? Do you think?
Yes, and there's a list of them in the, there's a sequence of hadith that respond to it, which is great for me because, these responses must have been produced early enough that the threat was a real threat, and then it gets cast in the form of a narrative. And then later, of course, this narrative responding to individual threats is not necessary anymore, because the authority of the envoys is canonized and cast into these four envoys. But then we still have the, all these these naughty people who were doubting the envoys. We can hear some of their voices. So one of them is this Ibn Hilal al-Askari that I quoted from. Yeah.
But they were all from this pre-existing hierarchy, you would say.
I think that one's interesting because he is marked out as an agent, a wakil. Okay. Are they all from the hierarchy against the agents? It's unclear. No, I don't think so. It's unclear. Sometimes it just says people did not accept him, or that kind of thing.
And I think it's more natural that people would be doubting the Imam's authority, whether during or after the Imam's lifetimes. Because for most of the period, the Imams lived very separate from their communities, first in Medina and then in Samarra under, as you say, under house arrest. And of course, given the nature of communications at that time, by the time like a letter or a rescript arrives somewhere, takes a long time. And then, of course, people are going to doubt. So much more so when the Imams are gone and when they are represented by some guy who claims that he's representing them.
Yeah, exactly. The very idea of imamate, of course, comes out of the need for the community to have a guide. So they could also withdraw if they no longer felt the need for such a guide, or it became. I think there's as well one of the stories I think is interesting, that there's clearly hadith. The Qummis are, the way that the story of the development of Twelver, thought is that you have these sort of little notebooks and that kind of thing around, but then with the occultation, the hadith really gets going. But in the quotation I provide you have people saying, well, you say you're an imam, so prove that you can reproduce what we have written down. So that hadith was already a challenge to the authority of the imams. And I think, that wasn't just that is one of the reasons that you have the collapse of the envoyship is because you have these other sources of authority. But the envoyship was important right at the beginning because there was fragmentation, there was chaos, and so in order for this community to continue, somebody needed to sort of, it was useful to have a centralized figure who could establish a consensus. Yeah.
I'll let you answer Mushail's other questions before we take just a few questions from the audience and conclude our session today.
Yeah. Well, I think, we've been talking in this area. I guess I would, the question of secrecy is very interesting. And yeah, I should look into that more as a separate topic in itself. A lot of when I see secrecy as in taqiyya discussed, I'm unsatisfied with the way it's dealt with, because in general, how I see taqiyya is not necessarily a sociological phenomenon that people expressed in their life, whether no doubt that was the case. But when I most often see it, it's used as a hermeneutic device to explain away contradictions in the sources. So if you're a faqih and you have two texts that contradict, you come in and say, it could be taqiyya. That's the main time I see secrecy. And so
but that's a later Bragg projection. That's not contemporary to the practice.
I believe it could be. If you're in Qom and you have these two sources and you can't immediately go to the Imam, then you could say, well, maybe it was taqiyya, I think that they're and again, I don't think that in Imam Twelver thought was born ex nihilo with the occultation, which is the assumption of almost everyone who works on Twelver intellectual history as well. You see hermeneutic moves in the Hadith. You see people writing to the Imam and saying, what happens if we have two Hadith that contradict? And the Imam says something like, well, sometimes he says, this is the answer. Okay, that's going to take a long time. You can't do that all the time. But yeah, there was a process of checking the Hadith, continual process of checking rulings with the Imam through letters. And that's what one of the things the agents were doing. But sometimes I think you probably would have to say, well, maybe it was clear, let's go with this one. So I think, yeah, it's true when I see it, yes, it's the result on the whole of a later move. But you see earlier ones about contradictions too. Hodgson has his article, Why Did the Early Shia Become Sectarian? So he has one of those instances of contradiction.
But if I can interject for a second, I think it's really fascinating as well how that the very idea of secrecy also is really prominent in Sunni thought, of course. It's the ghaib. I mean, it's in the Quran. I mean, it's very much there. There's a very kind of prominent thread of the idea of things that are hidden, and then that it's actually, I've never really thought about that before, about how that very same term then is used to describe the occultation. It's like something becomes hidden. And in that way of hiddenness that in the Quran say is what God knows. God is the master of the ghaib, the hidden. Yeah. And so therefore, like becoming closer to God in that sense. It's a very, that's actually, it's actually really just such a fascinating topic. It could almost be really a study in and of itself on the question of secrecy, power, religious authority in Islamic traditions more broadly, and then how those concepts of secrecy and power and authority interrelate in Shi'ism and in Sunnism, I think.
Yeah, and coming back to Mashaykh's suggestion that's one that as a middleman, the agents or whoever is the middleman between God and the community, or the Imam and the community, the use of secrecy is a device that allows you to increases your power or increases your influence in some way, because you are even more become the bottleneck through which things are mediated, because there's a lot is hidden.
That's absolutely it, and very much in Ismaili text too. I mean, that's really, it's like there are these levels that you can ascend through gaining knowledge of the secrets, right?
Yeah, and I would say that that probably is, I would have to look, and I think that it probably does merit a separate study for specifically for my period. Though in a way, I feel that my guys, the agents, are a little bit more improvisational. It's a moment of crisis, and some of the secrecy is just because, you know, are practical solutions as well. I think they're doctrine. So in a way, that would be very interesting to look at the practical solutions and the doctrinal frameworks. One of the famous things is that they say you mustn't name the Imam, you mustn't name the hidden Imam, and that even when he is named, sometimes it's spelled, you know, Mim Ha Mim Dal, you know. So his name's Muhammad, but it's done separated with no ligatures, just the, you know, the separated letters dash. So you're saying what his name is, but still you're sort of, I guess the envoys might have said, don't name him. And one of the reasons I imagine that this might have been a practical, and I think maybe this is dangerous because as well, there could be just doctrinal or, you know, reasons from the tradition. But one of the reasons I think might be useful not to name them is because people disagreed who the Imam was. And so maybe you just want to get everyone on board and then, you know, decide things later, you know. So there was, is the Imam the son of Hassan al-Askari, or during his lifetime, or through the concubine? And there are different things about the identity of the woman. And, you know, is it the brother? Is it, you know? So if we say we can't,
just a quick note, and of course, you mentioned practical necessity, and my point was that it's one thing to hide something, whether as a symbolic gesture or because you're afraid they might hang you. It's another thing to conceptualize it in doctrinal terms and say, listen, what I'm doing is taqiyya. These may or may not coincide. Someone may just hide something and not call it anything, whether they are Shi'i or not. So these are different things.
That's true. So I guess the way it would interact with my material is that general positive vision of taqiyya was established before my period. So I guess the question is, how is it used, or how is it? How does it determine events, and how does it mutate, I guess, as well, with, as Karen was pointing out, the link between ghaiba and taqiyya. But anyway, there's a lot of things to do there if somebody has a PhD student who wants to take it on.
Well, thanks a lot. I'll just take one question from, well, two questions from the audience. Khalil Andani was asking whether the differences between zakat, khums, and sadaqah were well defined in this period with distinct rates.
I have an article on khums, which I'll send you. Yes and no. I mean, zakat and sadaqah are the same in the sense that they're always called sadaqah in the texts, in the hadith, almost always. And then you just have to know that there's, you know, a sadaqah at Ramadan, which is not the same as the, you know, sadaqah that you pay yearly on gold and silver as a percentage of your capital. But there are fairly, you know, but then it gets more systematized in the post-occultation period.
Thanks. And I had also a question by Omar Ali Deonsaga, who is the head of the Quranic Studies Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. So he says that the Ikhwan al-Safa have an elaborate description of the Abdal in 440, 400, 4000, etc. Was the imagery of Abdal used in pre, during, or post-occultation sources in Proto-Twelver and Twelver circles?
Yeah, I haven't come across it. But again, I sort of skip on if I find something that's just kind of pure kind of intellectual, cosmological or descriptions of authority. But yeah, so I haven't seen that.
All right.
And the in general, the way that the agents are described is rather ad hoc and it's rather pragmatic sounding. They're called thiqa, ma'mun, wakil, and thiqa later increasingly becomes more of an epistemological character in the sources. But here I just think it means he is a reliable guy. You know, you can, if he carries money from your house to my house, there's not going to be like a couple of dirhams missing.
But that's very interesting because I mean, as you say, it sounds very practical and even materialistic. So where's the mystery, the esotericism in all this? Where's the charisma? Do you? I mean, are the agents of the hidden imam supposed to have any kind of charisma, or is it just people who are, as you say, reliable and can carry money without fleeing with it?
So if we take, it depends what you mean by charisma. So Weber describes charisma as a kind of contractual relationship between a person imbued with supernatural qualities and a community. But he doesn't say what and a community and the people who accept his authority. He doesn't say what those supernatural qualities are. And of course, the description of these supernatural qualities is always going to be mediated, you know, textually or orally, whatever. Or for most people, I mean, that some people maybe have a twinkle in their commanding voice. But for most of the community, it's I guess the reports about the agents who and we do have reports of miracles that are ascribed to them. Right. But the way it's characterized, of course, is it's all God, and then it's God via the Imam, and then the Imam down to the
So there is some kind of barakah that they draw from.
Yeah, I think that's how the system works, that there's it's reflected glory. But it's not very, if you compare it to the Ismaili, very, carefully constructed hierarchies, very carefully, conceptualized hierarchies. It's not, doesn't really look like that. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think this will conclude our session. I would like to thank you, Ed, for this wonderful presentation, and thank you, Musher and Karen, for kindly accepting to participate in our session today and contributing in making this discussion so lively and interesting. So the next lecture in the series will take place on the 17th of June, and it will be delivered by Dr. Salime Marsoudlou, who is from the McGill University in Canada. And her lecture is entitled Scholars, Apostasy and States in Medieval Islam, Historiographical and Juridical Issues. So the lecture will deal with accusations of apostasy and execution of two medieval scholars, Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamadani and Shihab al-Din Sohrawardi. And registrations for this lecture will be opened shortly. So thank you all for attending, thank you for participating, and hopefully see you in June for our next lecture.